so I'm talking about a more more traditional education setting, and that is higher education, and thinking about the potential role of online education uh, as an alternative to traditional face-to-face instruction in higher education. Um, and I think it's useful. I'm an economist, so I always like to start with talking about benefits and costs. And I think that there are a lot of reasons why people are extremely enthusiastic about thinking about the role of online education in higher ed. One is something about access, right? People lead busy lives. They may live far away from traditional college campuses. They may work. They may have families, etc. Online education provides an opportunity to essentially have flexibility over both space and time. There are lots of potential pedagogical benefits. We can alter our study pace. We can go back and review material if we didn't really get it the first time, or roll the tape once we've had the opportunity to do more reading and that type of thing. There are new technologies for engagement between faculty members and students, across students, for example. There are potential cost savings, especially when we think about mass instruction. So there's lots and lots of these. I've actually taught in a mass instruction setting. I've also taught in extremely small settings, not at Northwestern University. I haven't taught, but at my previous employer, University of Florida, I taught 2,000 students at a pop in an online education setting as well. So I've had the personal opportunity to experience some of these benefits, and I've also had the personal opportunity to experience some of the potential costs associated with online instruction. So there are potential pedagogical costs. There are aspects of face-to-face interactions which are difficult, if not impossible, to replicate in an asynchronous setting. There are issues regarding instructional scale, the types of ways we can assess students, the types of ways we can interact with one another. There are issues potentially regarding student accountability. It becomes, when you're in especially a mass instruction setting, it becomes easier to fall behind, for example, than might occur in a face-to-face setting. Plus, the idea that you're able to pace yourself might make it harder also. There are new opportunities for dishonesty as well that can happen. If you're anonymous, it's also possible, it becomes easier to have anonymous people also taking exams for you. And that type of thing could play a role then in terms of when we get into certification. How do we know that you are the person who actually has accumulated these particular sets of skills? There's a potential loss of community feel as well. So all of these are a number of different ways in which online instruction could both be beneficial as well as harmful. And I think anybody who's saying it's only good or only bad is probably not really being entirely truthful, because I see real important things. It's extremely hard to compare face-to-face instruction to online instruction. It hasn't stopped many, many people from doing it, but I mean, at the same time, there are often different kinds of students. Different people end up selecting into taking online versus face-to-face. There are different kinds of instructors. So sometimes you have instructors who are really, really particularly skilled and interested in teaching in online settings or face-to-face settings. Other times you don't. Take care. Thank you. There are different kinds of courses. Some courses, often it's the same course, but it's not necessarily. And very few studies have dealt with the so-called selection problems, which is that if you're seeing these different types of things, you can't just go and compare. Here's a typical face-to-face class. Here's a typical online class. Let's look at outcomes and see. There are a couple of different types of studies that have started to do this. I'm going to, in the next few minutes, roll through a number of these studies for you. One conducted by me, as well as several that weren't conducted by me, that are either randomized trials in which students are randomly assigned to be face-to-face instruction versus asynchronous online instruction, or there are also very careful observational studies that have done a particularly good job, I think, in terms of dealing with some of these selection problems. So mine was the first published study that used online. So, and since I'm also the presenter, I decided I'd lead off with that one. This was a large-scale randomized control trial of students who were at a flagship state university that's unnamed. It was an introductory economics class, which I did not teach. It was a large, and the students were randomly assigned to either have a large lecture with online resources or an entirely online equivalent course. The same instructor, same class, same exams, etc. What happened? Well, here everything for the rest of this talk, you'll be seeing the online version versus the face-to-face version. So the first thing we observe here is that, and just to show you, the things that are in solid green are statistically significant at conventional levels. The things in the outline are not statistically significant at conventional levels. The first thing we observe here is that across the board, we see point estimates that are negative in terms of student performance in the class. These are out of 100 points. The average performance reduction is modest. It's about 2.5 points lower out of 100. Of course, this is a class with a relatively tight distribution. So what that means is that was actually relatively meaningful. And then the thing that is important to note here is that the specific places that people who seem to be particularly disadvantaged in this particular experiment from having online versus face-to-face instruction are the relatively low achievers. These are students whose SAT scores, and we've done this a number of ways, but you can imagine SAT scores, high school GPA, et cetera, were below average for this university. Males and Latino students. And the Asian students we also see, even though it's not statistically significant, it was, the point estimates were also pretty negative for Asian students. It was almost statistically significant. So that's something that's, and that's actually a set of patterns that is gonna show up again and again over the next 5 minutes or so. Now, the next, there's been another randomized control trial, this time using, that's been published by Bilbo and Matt Chingos and co-authors, 6 public university campuses. And in this case, it was an introductory statistics class. In this case, it wasn't an online-only class. It was a hybrid class. So it was half of the instruction was done face-to-face, half of the instruction was machine-guided, versus a traditional face-to-face instruction. Now, unlike in my study, this particular study it wasn't the same professor, same class, but it was still an introductory statistics class that everybody was taking. What did they find? Okay, so on average, it was a mixed bag. So students who took the hybrid class versus face-to-face did have higher completion rates, and they had no different test scores from those in face-to-face. Interestingly enough, they thought they learned less in hybrid classes than face-to-face. They had lower overall impressions about the quality of the course, and they thought the class was harder. One thing which was kind of interesting that we see, a picture that in here that is somewhat interesting that we see in this particular paper is that it turns out that, I'll just interpret this for you in 2 minutes, or 30 seconds rather. It turns out that the students performing in the hybrid class tended to be amongst the very best performers. So that's these blue guys right here at the end, as well as disproportionately were amongst the very worst performers. And that's something, again, that's a little clue that I think we're going to start to take away from things, is that it turns out that sometimes really high-performing students do especially well in online types of settings. But again, particularly low-achieving students may be disadvantaged in online settings. Another experimental paper that's been out of CUNY, it's not yet published, but it's a very nice paper, is another economics class, a moderately selective public university. This is also hybrid. And in this particular paper, they find on average that the hybrid class hybrid students tended to underperform by actually about the same number as what I was seeing with the online only versus face-to-face. And the results seem to be driven by non-native English speakers, which is actually, again, somewhat consistent with what I saw the biggest negative results being with the Latino students in the first experiment. And one more experiment, and then I'll go and show you some other, is research from the University of Connecticut, introductory economics class again. Here again is traditional face-to-face versus hybrid versus online only. So this is the only experiment that I know of that has all three cases looked once. And here, what they found is that the hybrid and the face-to-face looked about the same, but the online only scored dramatically worse relative to either of the other two conditions. And here again, the results are really driven by those with low prior GPAs. So again, we're starting to see a common thread through all of the experimental literature that I know of on this subject, which is that the more online you get, the worse the kind of initially low achievers do, which makes me very particularly interested in, there's all this stuff you're seeing. Let's say one econ class, one stats class. Well, how about all types of classes? Well, you can't randomly assign all types of classes, but a really outstanding research paper now by Cassandra Hart and her co-authors at UC Davis is looking at 1 million students in every class in 110 community colleges in the state of California. And in this particular case, they're comparing traditional face-to-face instruction versus online classes. And here, now, who are the people who are going to community colleges? Not inevitably, but they tend to be amongst the students who would have been the relatively low achieving students at the types of universities I was describing before, the flagship schools and moderately selective public schools. They have extremely compelling controls for selection, even though it's not experimental. I mean, this passes, I think, any reasonable standard, in my opinion. And here, again, they're focusing on both grades as well as course completion. And arguably, I think course completion in a community college setting is a particularly important outcome to think about. Well, what do we find? Well, this is a great little graph here. Here we've lined up all 110 schools, and you see some confidence bands around all of these 110 schools. And what do we see? In almost every case, almost every community college in the state of California, the students who were doing the online classes were underperforming, and it's them comparing them against themselves. So they do systematically worse in terms of completion when they take an online class versus a face-to-face class. There are a handful of schools, only a tiny number, where they seem to do better. But the overwhelming majority, they're doing worse, usually significantly so. Just to put these numbers in perspective here, in some of these cases, you're 10 to 20%, 10 to 15% less likely to complete the class, which is a pretty big number when we're thinking about cases about college affordability, for example, and what are you getting with your tuition dollars. If you want to look at the next step, do you complete the class with a C or better? Now the results actually look even more dire for online versus face-to-face. So it's something that we need to kind of keep in mind. So what's my bottom line here? There are lots of very, very successful online education models. At the Northwestern University in the School of Education and Social Policy, we have a really outstanding group of faculty members in our Learning Sciences program who have demonstrated proven methods for educating students extremely well online. It's not that they can't be done, but so far we're having a really hard time taking those models to scale. And so those being taken to scale, at least in the places we're seeing, be it community colleges, be it good four-year universities at both the top level as well as the mid-level, don't seem to be realizing these potentials so far. Students are more successful in face-to-face courses versus they are in online formats. And it's especially so for students who are relatively likely to struggle in college. And so, investing in online education could be worth it. And I think we need to keep pushing and trying different types of things, figuring out ways to use the technology. But for now, there's no free lunch. There is for you. Right, but for society, not quite yet.